Hello and welcome back to another video. My name is CJ, the Populist New Yorker, and today we're going to be taking a look at why New England, which is a relatively blue region of the country, elects Republicans to its highest office, which is the governorship, more routinely than other blue states, and in fact very routinely, as we're going to see later on throughout this video. It's an interesting phenomenon that political pundits have been kind of in awe of for decades now, since around the 1990s. New England has been solidly Democratic for the most part when it comes to presidential and federal elections, although there are some exceptions. But when it comes to a state level, New England is a lot more complicated than just that. And there's a few reasons for that, and it's not necessarily the reason you would think going right off the bat. If you look at the 2020 election, New England as a whole, and specifically in this video, we're going to be looking at Massachusetts, Vermont, and New Hampshire. We're not really going to be taking a look at Maine so much, although we might mention it given the fact that Susan Collins is a Republican senator from Maine, but we're mainly looking at the governorship elections in Maine at the moment. So we're going to focus on Massachusetts, Vermont, and New Hampshire. Massachusetts and Vermont voted nearly 2-1 for President Joe Biden over Donald Trump. New Hampshire was the only state that was relatively close at around +7 for Joe Biden. But the thing that makes these states all have in common is that they currently have Republican governors, and they all re-elected their Republican governors in 2018 and 2020 respectively by gigantic margins, especially considering the political environment federally for these states. So the first state we're going to be looking at is the state of Massachusetts. So Joe Biden won every single county in the state of Massachusetts. The closest he got to losing a county was in Bristol County, which he still won by 12 points. Plymouth County is +17, +18 in Worcester County, and 17 in Hampton County. These are the only counties that are relatively close, where Joe Biden got under 60% of the vote. If we take a look, of course, on the state level, though, Massachusetts is a lot different when it comes to governor's elections. And I stress governors because attorney generals, lieutenant governors, if they're elected separately or not, they tend to do, Republicans rather, tend to do a lot worse. You know, attorney general, you're not really going to get an attorney general, even a liberal Republican in Massachusetts, really. It just isn't how the state works. So we're going to be looking at the political party strength of the state of Massachusetts, and what you'll notice, Massachusetts is solidly blue, with the exception of a fluke election in 2010 with Scott Brown winning a special Senate election upon the death of longtime Senator Ted Kennedy. You'll notice that the only areas of red you really see are, well, treasurer, and you have to go back to the 90s for this, but really the governorship, specifically the fact that Massachusetts had 3 Republican governors in a row. You know, this is one of the bluest states in the entire country. So the question is why? Why did Massachusetts have 3 Republican governors in a row? And the answer isn't just that, well, you know, these are more liberal Republicans. That's true. But a lot of blue states, you know, run more liberal Republicans if they hope to win. You know, we saw that in New Jersey in 2017 with Kristi's lieutenant governor, a pro-choice governor. Certainly not as right-wing as the Republican Party nationally. Of course, we saw that in Illinois when Bruce Rauner won in 2014. He was a much more liberal Republican, and he was riding a red wave. But even with that, you know, very liberal Republican record, he went on to lose in a landslide in 2018 in the governorship. But why does it work so well in New England? But one of the reasons why New England specifically is so different is there's a couple. New England states are very small, you know, geographically speaking. Massachusetts is a small state. It's densely populated, unlike New Hampshire and Vermont, but it is a small state nonetheless. You also have to go into the fact that Massachusetts, like California, Massachusetts voters are a lot more fiscally conservative than voters in other blue states, and that's one of the reasons why Charlie Baker remains a very popular governor. He's a relatively fiscally conservative Republican, but if you go on social issues, you know, he's a very liberal Republican, basically. He's to the left of certainly the National Republican Party, but even, you know, some other blue state governors who happen to be Republicans, like Larry Hogan. Massachusetts, not as much, but the other states, Vermont, New Hampshire, have long histories of being Republican strongholds as recently as the 1980s. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on to those states later in the video. So I want to look at the 2018 election in Massachusetts. We saw Charlie Baker, very popular governor, mainly because he's pro-business, but mainly because he also ran a very good campaign. But this wasn't without hardship, of course. Baker actually ran in 2014. He won. That's when he won his first term. But he ran in 2010 against Deval Patrick, who was not an unpopular governor, but he was riding sort of the Republican sentiment in a way. And he only lost the governorship by 6 points in 2010. He came back in 2014 to beat Martha Coakley. Martha Coakley, for some reason, can't really win a federal office, or a statewide office, excuse me. She lost the Senate race against Scott Brown in 2010 and went on to lose the governorship to Charlie Baker by around 2 points. For some reason, the state of Massachusetts in particular likes fiscal responsibility. They like liberal Republicans. Of course, they vote Democrats to the governor's mansion as well. You know, Deval Patrick, the last governor, was a Democrat. But if we look at this sheet overall, there has only been one Democratic governor in the state of Massachusetts since 1991, which is a long time ago. Deval Patrick was the only Democratic governor since 1991 in Massachusetts. So Massachusetts, in some cases, not as ready to elect or just has, for some reason, a favorability of electing Republicans to the executive mansion. And I think it's because Massachusetts is a fiscally conservative state, generally speaking. At least when it comes to statewide affairs, they seem to like that. And sometimes the Democrat they're running against isn't too great. Martha Coakley, for example. You know, Charlie Baker lucked out that Martha Coakley, in 2010, she ran a very entitled campaign for the Senate. She didn't really campaign a lot. She kind of thought since Massachusetts was a blue state, it would be in the bag. And that was a Senate race. You know, we're not even talking about Senate races in this video in particular. We're talking about the governor's races. But she lost a Senate race to a Republican, which is embarrassing in a state as blue as Massachusetts. So it sometimes comes down to the candidate, but the there's a factor of the candidates and, of course, the environment that the state is in. And next, we're going to go to Vermont and New Hampshire because these states are a bit different than Massachusetts. Again, they're all New England states, but they all have different reasons why they elect Republican governors. We're going to move on to the state of Vermont now. Vermont is not as red as Massachusetts is on the governor's level, but Vermont elects a lot more Republicans to other positions like lieutenant governor and auditor. Vermont's a very community-oriented state, less so than Massachusetts, and this also ties into New Hampshire. So we can also kind of do both of these states at the same time, although New Hampshire is a bit different too because New Hampshire is redder and is actually somewhat competitive nationally, whereas Vermont and Massachusetts aren't. But Vermont is one of the smallest states in the country by population. I believe it's the second smallest state by population. And this means that, it's a rural state, it's a small state. People are very community-oriented. One of the reasons why Phil Scott defeated Sue Minter in the 2016 election, despite Hillary Clinton winning the state by 26 points, Phil Scott won the state by nearly 10. He was a lieutenant governor, so that probably played into a factor of it. But Phil Scott seemed like a very mild-mannered, very approachable guy, and many people in Vermont appreciated that. And Phil Scott is probably the most liberal Republican in a position of power in the United States because, of course, he's running probably the most liberal state policy-wise in the entire country. So Phil Scott, you put him in other states, he would have a D next to his name. He'd be a Democrat. But I guess he's to the right of Vermont Democrats to some extent, although I think Democrats overwhelmingly voted for him in 2020 for re-election. And if we go back to 2018, of course, Phil Scott had a lot of success, winning by 15 points in the 2018 election against Christine Hallquist. And if we go to 2020, of course, Phil Scott actually won a larger margin in Vermont than Joe Biden did in Vermont, 68-27. He won a 31-point margin of victory against progressive turned Democrat, because he's part of the Progressive Party, ran under a Democrat, Lieutenant Governor David Zuckerman. So Vermont is different because it's a very community-oriented state. All these states relative, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts to some extent, are very homogenous states. And with this, you have a very community-oriented politics. You have politics being less about party. Of course, people look at the issues. Vermont would never elect a conservative Republican. Neither would Massachusetts. New Hampshire is a bit different because New Hampshire, again, is nationally competitive. But I do find it very interesting that one of the bluest regions of the country, and two states in particular, Massachusetts and Vermont, are electing Republican governors. Most of this current governor's map, fits in roughly with the politics of the state. Most of the states are Republican governors, are Republican-leaning states. Most of the states with Democratic governors, of course, are Democratic states. Of course, with a few exceptions, and New England is the big exception. In 2020, again, Vermont voted for Joe Biden 66% to 30%. Vermont is one of those states that'll almost never be viable for the Republican Party anytime soon in a federal election. It's a very, very liberal, progressive state. And nonetheless, if you go back to, again, since 1991, Vermont's had 2 Democratic governors and 2 Republican governors, albeit these governors were very liberal governors. But nonetheless, these governors served as Vermont's chief executives. Of course, you had the lieutenant governor's position also being among Democrats, and the auditor. Now, of course, these Republicans, Jim Douglas, Phil Scott, very, very liberal, would be considered Democrats in basically any other state. But nonetheless, in Vermont, it works, and it makes the Republican Party viable. Of course, many Republicans would argue to what end. Phil Scott does about 90% of what a Democrat would do in his position. Maybe 10% he disagrees on, again, some fiscal issues. It's almost never social issues with any of these governors. But Chris Sununu is the exception. And we're going to look at the state of New Hampshire now, because New Hampshire actually since 1991, this is a little skewed. We'll do since 1989. We've had 4 Republican governors, 3 Democratic governors. Vermont and New Hampshire elect governors every 2 years. New Hampshire is a lot redder on the state level when it comes to state senate, state house, whatever the chief executive council is. I'm not really familiar with New Hampshire politics. I'm guessing this acts kind of like the governor's cabinet. I think that's exactly what it does. And of course, we've had Senate races in New Hampshire that are competitive. Kelly Ayotte only lost by like 1,000 votes in 2016. Maggie Hassan in potentially a competitive race in 2022. That remains to be seen if we see Chris Sununu run for the governorship. But Chris Sununu was able to buck national trends in 2016 when Hillary Clinton won the state of New Hampshire by just 0.3%. We saw Governor Chris Sununu win the state of New Hampshire by around 2.3%. Now, one of the reasons for this is that, I think 3.2% or 3.3%, something like that. Not too great at math. But one of the reasons for this is that Chris Sununu is part of a dynasty, a political dynasty. John Sununu, his father, was a senator who actually lost re-election to Jeanne Shaheen. But nonetheless, Chris Sununu remains a very popular governor. And what makes him different than Charlie Baker and Phil Scott is that he is not really a liberal Republican. He's Republican, he's right-wing policy-wise. And he remains very popular in the state of New Hampshire. We saw him win re-election in 2018, 52-45. That's a pretty good margin for a blue wave year. In fact, it's a very good margin for a blue wave year, winning by around 7 points, the same margin Joe Biden won the state in the 2020 election. And we can go look at 2020 now, in which Chris Sununu, Joe Biden gets 52-45. Chris Sununu overperforms Joe Biden by a massive amount, 65-33. Now, part of this could be because of COVID. I'm sure that with Phil Scott, too, COVID gave him a big boost. COVID helped a lot of incumbent governors because many voters recognize that, governors were put in a very difficult situation when it came to it, and a lot of them, stepped up to the challenge and looked like leaders and people rewarded that with giving them second terms in the executive mansion. Now, New Hampshire, again, is different than Vermont and Massachusetts, because Vermont and Massachusetts are almost always, or always since the 1980s, blue states federally. New Hampshire is the only exception. But, you know, New England has this strange dynamic, and again, it comes down to community. It's a very community-oriented region. The states are small. They're fairly close-knit. And Vermont and New Hampshire are very rural states. So there's a very different dynamic at play with these states when it comes to Republicans. It's more about meeting the people, getting to know the candidates, and that close-knit community feeling you have in places like Vermont and New Hampshire that you don't have in a big populated state like New York or Illinois or California or Washington when it comes to these governor's races. So even if you had Phil Scotts in these other states, they still wouldn't be, they would still have an uphill battle, whereas in Massachusetts, Vermont, and New Hampshire, they certainly would have a much easier time getting reelected. Of course, as a Republican in a blue state, things are always going to be against you. But if you're in a state like Massachusetts, where you've only had one Democratic governor since the 1990s, that is definitely going to be difficult for you. Even with it being a blue state, all you need is a pro-business liberal Republican to run, and they basically have the election handed to them. That's the way it seems in Massachusetts and these other states anyway. The last thing I want to look at is, of course, exit polls and by ideology. We're going to look at ideology. We're not really going to pay attention to race too much because in New Hampshire, the state is over 90% white, so they don't even have data for other races. I wish they did, though, so I could compare the two results. We're going to look at mainly the results between the governor's election in New Hampshire and the presidential election in New Hampshire. So Joe Biden won the state of New Hampshire by 7 points. As you can see, we're not really going to take a look at regions so much, but Trump only won 2 regions of the state out of 5. We could go down a bit and look at party ID, ideology, and we're not really going to look at race. So party ID and ideology. Joe Biden got 94% of Democrats. He got 10% of Republicans in New Hampshire, and he got 62% of independents. So New Hampshire, according to these exit polls, has more, like almost 10% more Republicans than Democrats. But the independents in New Hampshire skew largely Democratic. But it's these independent voters that in New Hampshire, in Vermont, are very malleable, whereas in other states they aren't. In other states they tend to split 45-45, and the other maybe 10% is up for grabs. But in these states, independents are really a lot more independent-minded than in other states around the country, which is why you have Republicans being elected to these states. When we go to ideology, Biden got 93% of liberals, 64% of moderates, and 9% of conservatives. We can compare that to the governor's election. Now, keep in mind, in the governor's election in New Hampshire, we had... Where is it? We had Kristi win 65 to 33%. So keep that in mind when we look at these exit polls. So when we take a look down to party ID, Sununu won 98% of Republicans, just 2% of Democrats. 21% of Democrats, Chris Sununu won. And independents, he got 65-33, which, interestingly enough, is the exact number here, basically, as to how he won the state at large. Independents make up nearly 50% of New Hampshire's electorate, which is why, even after all this time of New Hampshire consistently rejecting Republicans on the presidential level, the margins and the fact that independent voters make up such a large percentage of this state and are as malleable as they are is why Republicans still, cycle after cycle, still try for New Hampshire. It's because of this. And if we look at ideology, Feltus, the opponent of Chris Sununu, only got 77% of liberals compared to Biden, who got 93% of liberals. Only got 31% of moderates. Sununu got 67% of moderates. Biden got 64% of moderates. So that's really an interesting swing there in the state of New Hampshire. And conservatives, of course, 95 to 4. Biden got 9% of conservatives. Sununu got 4%. Feltus got 4% of conservatives. So, again, to summarize, why New England is electing these Republicans. There are a number of factors. Of course, it depends on the opponent, who the candidates are in the race, who's the Republican, who's the Democrat, and what their policies are. Of course, you could be running after, an unpopular incumbent with Phil Scott in 2016. He was running, after an unpopular governor, Peter Shumlin. He tried to institute a universal healthcare system in Vermont. It failed pretty miserably, and as a result, his approval rating went down significantly, and paved the way for somebody like Phil Scott to win the governorship by 9 points in a state that voted for Hillary by 26. You can also look at, how the state views fiscal issues, like Massachusetts, a fairly fiscally conservative, pro-business oriented state, would rather elect a liberal Republican than your standard Democrat. And you can see that by how they vote in governor's races from, the 1990s all the way to today. One Democratic governor, 4 Republican governors really says something. And New Hampshire, of course, it all comes down to the independent and moderate voters in New Hampshire who really swing this state dramatically, whether it's Democrat or dramatically Republican. So, it makes New England a really, really interesting region of the state, especially politically. It's a really cool place to visit, too, if you haven't. It's a really beautiful area of the country as well. But anyway, guys, thank you all for watching. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed. Subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos that I put out. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.